In today's video, we're going to learn lots of fun and interesting information about blue watercolor paints. So first of all today, forgive me if the lighting isn't great in today's video. I've just broken one of my two film lights and I need new film lights, haven't got any money, so there's that. Also, if my voice sounds a little bit off, I've had a cold. I am recovering very well indeed. In fact, it's pretty much gone, but it has just left me a little bit stuffy. So I'm going to start off in this video talking about blue paint, and we're going to look at some of my favourite blue colours. Now, just a disclaimer, I can't possibly include all of the blue pigments that exist, and I can't talk culturally about all of the things that we think about blue and the way blue exists in the world. But I'm just going to cover that briefly, and then we're going to look at individual colours, what they are and what you can do with them, because we want this video to be practical and to teach us more about colour mixing and how we can use these beautiful pigments in our own work. So let's talk about blue. The first thing that's interesting about blue is it's the rarest pigment in the world. There's very little blue in nature, and often when you do see things that are blue, it's kind of like nature's optical illusion. They aren't really blue, they're just reflecting a blue light. Although to an extent that's true of all colours. It's also a colour that hasn't always had a name. So if we look back at very ancient documents, people didn't have a word for blue, and there's actually been, I saw a documentary, there's actually been people that were discovered even in this century living in small tribes that don't have a word for the colour blue. And what's even more mind-blowing about that is because they don't have a word for the colour blue, they often use green to cover blue as well. So blue and green is just one word, it's the same colour name. They often can't see very easily the difference between blue and green, which helped scientists to discover that there's this strong link between colour and language. It's believed that if you don't have a word for a colour, it literally makes you less able to see it. What we see is affected by our brains, which makes sense when you consider that colour is just our brains interpreting a reflection of light. So blue is a rare colour, it's a colour that's not always had a name, and it's a colour that across the world people see very differently. In Europe, it's considered to be a beautiful colour, it's considered to be about the sky, it's often considered to be a royal colour. It was often used to paint the Virgin's robes in those beautiful paintings that you might see somewhere hanging in perhaps the Vatican, where you'll see an awful lot of blue usage. It's not only a religious connotation, but it's also meant to show the wealth of the person that commissioned the art, because that blue was originally made with often lapis lazuli, which is an incredibly rare and expensive stone to be making paint out of. Nowadays we can synthesize that colour, but at one time putting blue in your paintings was a way of saying, well, I am very rich, I own this blue painting, I commissioned this work with blue in it because I have got bags of money. Blue was also the first ever synthetic pigment, which was invented by the Egyptians, and I know no more romantic story than that of Egyptian blue. So this is a colour that is seen in ancient Egyptian artworks, but it was lost to modern science for thousands of years. They couldn't figure out how the Egyptians actually made Egyptian blue. In about 1800 something, about 200 years ago, basically they worked out the formula, and it's not actually that difficult, and it had to do with some ingredients that were in the local sand. And we can now make Egyptian blue, but it's still quite an expensive pigment. I'd love to tell you what it looks like, but every photograph I've seen of it makes it look different. As for blue in modern life, there are still some cultures where blue actually isn't considered to be a good colour at all, which is why if you look at some Asian art, you'll see a strong emphasis on reds and yellows and pinks and very little blue. It's actually considered in some parts of the world to be unlucky, or even something that if you had contact with, you would need cleansing from. However, all of that being said, it's considered, and surveys have been done recently, it's the most popular colour in the world. If you ask everybody what's their favourite colour, then blue is right up there. So I've talked for long enough about blue. Let's jump in and look at some individual blue colours. And I've picked the ones that are the most well known and the most popular that you are likely to find in your palette. Let's look at what each one is and how we can use it in our paintings. Let's talk about what was always my favourite colour, at least when I first started painting. I couldn't even say it's not my favourite colour now. It's just that I've discovered so many beautiful colours. I no longer find that an easy thing to answer. This is Cerulean Blue. Now, I often find that beginners get really disillusioned with this colour, and they're just, oh, it's very weak and it's grainy. I've discovered that it's actually a colour where you'll see a cheap paint more than any other colour. In other words, it's a good idea to get a really good cerulean blue. This one is by Talens Rembrandt. Now, if we water it down, we'll see that it's quite a weak colour, and hopefully you can see on camera it's got that granulation. Now, unlike some other blues that also have granulation, such as ultramarine, cerulean always looks really delicate. When you mix it with another colour, it separates on the paper. It's a fantastic colour for skies because it doesn't go too dark and it's not too warm, so it tends not to look unnatural. Now, cerulean is usually made from pigment 35 or pigment 36, usually 35. I like to use it to make really soft but never murky greens. And depending which yellow you mix it with, you could mix it with a warmer yellow. Let's pop a little bit of yellow ochre down, and you can get all sorts of different greens. This is a very watery mix we've got here. It'll never go fully dark, so if you're looking for a strong dark green, you're never going to get it with cerulean blue, but it's absolutely beautiful for mixing those soft light grey greens you get in gardens. It can also be added to lemons and pinks to make Caucasian type skin tones, so the lighter, cooler of the skin tones. It's a very light, fast, but very pale colour. It's not a staining colour, so it lifts fairly easily. Another thing I love to use cerulean blue for is for mixing lilacs. So if we take our cerulean and I add something like a permanent rose, we can get these soft lilac tones coming through. Again, it will never make a strong purple. And in addition to greens and lilacs like this, it can be used in mixes with pink and lemon to make a whole host of not only skin tones, but also pale colours like cream and stone. It's one of the most useful colours in my palette. Let's talk about a similar colour. This one is our first fake colour. So let's talk about manganese blue. It's a pigment that's rarely available nowadays and is actually considered to be toxic. What I've got here is some Daniel Smith manganese blue hue. Now, if you see the word hue on a tube of paint, what that means is you're not getting the real colour, you're getting something that looks like the colour. So hue just means colour. It's the difference between chocolate and chocolate flavour. If something says chocolate flavour, you know you're not getting real chocolate. So why would Daniel Smith, who's a really good brand, swap this pigment out? As I said, it's toxic. Now, there are other reasons that pigments are swapped out, and they're not always good reasons. Sometimes they may be replacing an expensive pigment with a cheaper one. And so the word hue can be problematic, but in this case, it's fine. So what is this if it's not manganese blue? It's a very specific type of phthalo blue, because all pigments have variations, and you can also change the colour of them by adjusting the grind size and the type of binder and the amount of binder used. And here Daniel Smith have made this manganese blue hue. I love it because it's brighter and punchier than cerulean. If we compare it to our cerulean blue, it's almost like somebody mixed cerulean with phthalo blue and they had a baby. So anything we can do with cerulean, we can also do with manganese blue. I love to use it for skies. It's more controllable than phthalo blue. We can warm up that sky a little bit by popping a little pink in. You see, if we put a lot of pink in, we start to get, again, some beautiful lilacs. And just like our cerulean, we can get some greens as well. Notice they're a little bit fresher and brighter. That's because of that phthalo pigment. Look at that nice background I've made there. I'm not even going to adjust it. It looks so pretty. So if you're looking for a brighter, more turquoise version of cerulean, or you just want to have one colour instead of having both cerulean and phthalo blue, this manganese blue hue might be your answer. Since we've been talking so much about phthalo blue, let's do that one next. Now you'll notice on this manufacturer's sample, it says phthalo blue green shade. You may also have seen phthalo blue red shade. So what does red shade and green shade mean when you find it on a tube of paint? Now it's talking about whether the pigment tends towards the blue end of the spectrum or the yellow-green end of the spectrum. So it's about warmth and coolness. Now at this point, some smart alecs metallic always comes into the comments and says, oh no, the word shade doesn't mean that shade relates to how light and dark. I know all of that. However, this is just how the manufacturers use it, and I'm not responsible for that. They use the word shade to mean colour and warmth and coolness. Yes, it's inaccurate, but it's what they do. So we're here to learn. So let's swatch this. Now, Phthalo Blue is an incredibly strong colour. It's a staining colour. It's not granulating colour. So therefore it will give a smooth effect. And because it's so strong, it can make very dark colours. So a small amount of this paint goes a long way. That's not to say it can't be used with lots of water to make very pale colours. But it does mean that if you're a beginner, you may accidentally put too much in and find it quite hard to manage. Now, just like all of our other blues, we can mix it with reds to make purples. If you're making a purple, it's best to use a pink rather than a scarlet red. So let's try it with our pink. And you see the strength of colour that we can get, these strong magentas. But if we add more blue, we'll get some strong purples as well. And it can be added to all sorts of yellows to make incredibly bright greens with real strength of colour. In fact, if you could only have one blue in your palette, or if you're making a travel palette, I would certainly choose Phthalo Blue, just because from a mixing standpoint, it has the greatest amount of versatility. And it is in fact closest to the primary colour palette that printers use in their cyan, yellow and magenta palette. This would be your closest blue, because you can warm up a cool blue, but you can't cool down a warm blue. Now, if you're confused as to whether blues are warm or cool, remember that all blues are inherently cool. Of the three primaries, it's the only cool primary. But you should also remember that the classification of warm versus cool is entirely human-made and entirely arbitrary. It doesn't really exist. Colours don't have a temperature. Generally, with artists, if they talk about a blue being warm, they're talking about it heading towards that red-purple end of the spectrum. And if they're talking about a blue being cool, they're talking about it heading towards that yellow-green turquoise end of the spectrum. But again, you could argue that a blue with red in is just as warm as a blue with yellow in. If you're enjoying this video, please do click the thumbs up button. I know it's tiresome, I know it's very time consuming and very tiring on your fingers, but it does help the YouTube algorithm to know that this is a good video and that you enjoyed watching it. Don't forget to subscribe as well. As you know, this channel is fully CAD approved. Let's talk about Ultramarine Blue. Widely considered to be one of the most beautiful blues on the planet. As we spoke about in the beginning of this video, it was originally made from precious stones and so was a sign of immense wealth. But now, of course, we've found a way to make it synthetically. So you don't have to be a millionaire to buy yourself some ultramarine. Ultramarine comes in different versions too. They tend to be categorized slightly different. You can get an ultramarine deep, or sometimes called ultramarine dark, which is very strong. You can get a French ultramarine, which tends to be a little bit more on the purple side. It's a blue that already leans very heavily towards purple. Therefore, it's fantastic for adding to pink and making some beautiful magentas and royal purples. What it's less successful at is greens, by which I mean you won't get a bright green from ultramarine. It simply isn't possible because that tendency to have a slight hint of red in it means that when you mix it with yellow, you're actually mixing almost all three of the primaries. You've got the yellow, the blue, and the touch of red that's in the ultramarine. However, if you're looking for really natural greens, then ultramarine may be just the thing you want. It's never going to look unnatural and bright, but I have sometimes found that with beginners, if it's the only blue they have in their palette, their landscapes will all look somewhat dull. If using it in a landscape or a garden painting, it's great to contrast it with some fresher, brighter greens, because in a landscape we have all different types of greens. Another thing that's really fun with ultramarine, which is a heavily granulating colour, is to mix it with browns. Got some burnt sienna here, or even oxide reds. You'll get some beautiful moody colours. And a great trick if you've got a brown that's too warm is to add some ultramarine. You see how it begins to push that brown towards grey. You can almost make your own sepia. Let's look at Cobalt Blue next. It was originally made as a sort of substitute for ultramarine, and it really is very similar. It's usually slightly less warm, and although it does granulate, it's slightly less granulating than ultramarine. Here we can compare the two. It's a great all-round blue. It can look really effective in skies where ultramarine may just be a little bit too strong, especially if you live in a cooler climate. I've often told people I don't like ultramarine in skies, and I sometimes get some pushback from people in warmer climates saying that it's a great colour for where they live. But I have to say that here in mostly freezing England, ultramarine is a bit too warm for skies, but you can see that you can get some great effects with cobalt. I love it for greens as well. It produces a really mid-range green. I want to say a really blue green, but that sounds ridiculous when we're just talking about blues today. But if you think of tulip leaves, if you think of that real blue green, often cobalt is just the best colour for that sort of green. We can also, of course, make purples from it, and just like ultramarine, it can be mixed with browns and oxide reds to give a whole host of interesting, slightly granular neutrals. So just before we go on to the last blues that I'm going to speak about today, and there are two more, I want to just explain how I sort my blue paints out. So first of all, we started with cool blues. So those ones are in this pot here. So these are our turquoise blues. So that was our phthalo, our manganese, our cerulean. Also got some other blues in here, some mixed turquoise blues. Then we went on to our warm blues, our cobalts and our ultramarines. I keep them in this one here, but I've got a third category. These are my dark and muted blues. So as well as warm and cool properties, blues can be muted just like any other colours, often with the addition of some neutral pigments or with black. Imagine khaki green. It's a warm green, but it's been muted down to be a grey green. Now, as well as blues in this pot, and I'm going to talk about two of them next, I also keep my Payne's Grey. Now, we're not doing Payne's Grey in this video, but Payne's Grey has so much blue pigment in, and all greys are majority blue pigment, but Payne's Grey has so much blue pigment in that I keep it in with my dark blues, because when mixed, it behaves very much like a muted blue. So let's talk about one of these next. So let's look at our first muted dark blue, and a real favourite of mine here is Prussian Blue. When I started painting, this was actually the first sort of strong staining colour that I discovered outside of the first few that I used, and it's beautifully muted, but it's not too dull. We're going to look at one that's more muted than this in a moment. I find this really useful actually for sort of moody skies, and you can see just as a sky colour on its own, watered down, and if we add something like a little Payne's Grey to it, we can start to get some really moody grey sky colours. But it's also fabulous for, again, dark and stormy purples. So let's start with some pink. See how it overpowers the pink straight away, even though the pink is quite a strong colour. When I first bought Prussian Blue, I loved it so much, but honestly, I ruined every painting for about 6 months because it's just so strong. But here you see we get those slightly more gothic purples, but they're still not dull. Now, another thing that Prussian Blue is great for is making really, really dark greens. You'll never get really dark greens from Cerulean, and even things like Cobalt and Ultramarine, you'll struggle to get them, you know, the darkest green that they can be. I'm grabbing some yellow here. It has got a little bit of green still in it because I haven't cleaned my palette yet. But you'll see that we can mix these colours together, and it doesn't have to be a cool yellow like this one. You can go to the warmer yellows that are all the way up to an earth colour like yellow ochre here. And again, you can get those really strong dark greens that are going to make all the difference to your garden and landscape paintings. So I should have mentioned there that Prussian Blue is pigment PB27. Now the last one we're going to look at today is this one here. It looks very similar at first glance. This one is Indigo Blue, and it's the first one of our blues today that's nearly always a mixed pigment. What that means is that the manufacturer makes this pigment from more than one colour. When you get a mixed pigment, and Payne's Grey would be another mixed pigment, what you find is that each manufacturer has a different version. So although if you take a single pigment like Ultramarine Blue, although you'll find multiple versions of it, they all look very similar. So we're just getting a slight difference in the pigments or in the blend. But once you go on to colours where we have mixed pigments, then you get more of a difference. So one Payne's grey may look very different from another manufacturer's Payne's grey. So the Prussian blue I used was Talens Rembrandt. I will list them all in the video description. This one is a Winsor and Newton colour, and this is indigo. So this is an interesting one. So why is this a mixed pigment? It's because traditionally indigo wasn't a watercolour pigment at all. It was a dye. And so manufacturers of watercolours want to kind of try and match the colour. They want to make something that looks like a traditional indigo dye. So traditionally indigo was made from a plant, and it was so valuable at one time that it was known as blue gold. So we see it's somewhat similar here to Prussian, but it's got less of that turquoise and more sort of gothic to it. Now some manufacturers include black pigments. This one has actually got 3 different pigments in it, and many of them have a base of, I always struggle to say this, Idanthron blue, which is PB60. I'm just going to have a look at this one. Now, interesting here, we have PBK6. Now, PBK means it's a black pigment. We have PV19, PV would be violet, and PB15, which is a blue. So we've got lots of different things mixed in here to make something that looks like a natural indigo dye. Now we see that it's quite dull and quite dark, so it's good for making strong colours, and it's also could almost be used as a substitute for black. So I like to use colours like this if I'm painting a sunset and there are some strong darks in there. For instance, there are trees silhouetted. I'll always use a dark blue, a dark violet, a dark brown, rather than actually using a black. Now I do sometimes use black in painting, but it never looks very good in sunsets. For some reason, it works for photographers and it doesn't work very well for artists. So let's see what happens when we mix it with the 2 primaries. So let's go in with our pink first of all, and I would expect a very muted, strong purple, which is exactly what we're getting here. And you see already, look at that for sunset colours. It's just beautiful. Let's try making some greens from it. Now I'm mostly showing in this video what happens when you mix with either pink to make purples or you mix with yellow to make greens, because those are the most useful mixes for these colours. But you can of course mix them with any other colour in your palette, particularly browns, and get some really interesting colours. Let's mix it with yellow. So here I've got quite a lot of lemon yellow. And again, we're getting some real strong dark greens that look a lot more natural than if we were to use something like Phthalo Blue, where we would end up with that real bright, harsh, unnatural green, which can be nice in places. And the last thing I would say about any of your blues is they can be mixed with other blues. Now this is particularly useful when creating skies. I've got some cobalt turquoise here. So it's a blue we're not really covering in this video because it's not one of the more common ones. But just to say that you can mix any of your blues together in order to get the exact colour that you're looking for. Look at that for a pool of water. Beautiful colours. Every palette needs a few staining colours because you simply can't get these incredibly strong darks without them. Even colours that are dark and fairly strong like ultramarine, you'll get the strongest dark greens and the strongest dark purples by having a staining colour in your palette too. So it's all about choosing the best colour each situation. None of these blues is better than the other. I'm sure you have your favourites and they can all be useful to your painting. And the ones you choose may depend on whether you're a flower painter, a garden painter, landscapes, cityscapes or people. I hope this video has given you information that's going to help you choose the right ones for you, or you can just, like me, have them all. So let me know in the comments firstly which is your favourite blue to paint with. And also, if you'd like me to make any other videos like this about reds, about pinks, about yellows, let me know that down in the comments as well. And don't forget to share this video with anyone you think might find it useful. And before you leave this video, don't forget to have a look in the video description. There's all sorts of free stuff down there for you. I'll link to my full colour mixing playlist. You can even find out about my free and paid watercolour painting and drawing courses. I'll put up another useful colour mixing video for you to watch right now.